All over the world, people are starting to get excited about a theory concerning buried buildings. The theory is that at some point in human history, probably 200 or 300 years ago, there was an enormous global disaster that partially buried buildings in great cities around the world. But we're never told about it, and it's effectively been erased from history. Does that sound crazy to you? We imagine it probably does. But then we invite you to look a little deeper. There's evidence of buried buildings not only in Russia, but in many famous cities around the world. And the official explanation as to why they look the way they do leaves a lot to be desired. It's said the theory began in Russia, and it's easy to see why. Moscow has more buried buildings that appear to have been buried than perhaps anywhere else on Earth. You can even see it at the Kremlin, where the walls of the original building appear to be positioned below the newer one, propping it up. Why is the old building so far below the new one? There hasn't been so much change in the level of the land in the past few centuries, or at least not that we know about. Reconstruction work at the Moscow Polytechnic Museum also brought some interesting footage to light. With the building built on the side of a hill, why does it appear that parts of it appear to be as far as 16 feet below the ground? Subsidence is an issue in Moscow, but not to this extent. You would need a large ladder to gain access to the current front door of some of these properties from the original door, which is so much further below them. Then, we have to talk about the networks of underground tunnels and buildings, too. The official explanation is that these are sewers, but sewers were never known to have been constructed in such a way at the time we're told they were built. These passageways are allegedly from the 16th century. If that's true, then how were they constructed? How could this have been made by teams of men using pickaxes with equipment dragged by a horse and cart? Moving on from Russia for a moment, we can see evidence of similar happenings in Rome, the capital of Italy. This is early footage of excavation work taking place in and around Rome early in the 20th century. In some scenes, even the world-famous Colosseum is being dug out of a thick layer of mud and filth. If work on this scale was required to dig these buildings out, then what could have put so much mud and detritus there in the first place? We'll move on to theories in a moment, but consider it yourself for a moment. You would need to bring mud in by the truckload to create this kind of a problem, and the people of the time didn't have trucks to move it with. Also, the Colosseum is one of the most historically significant and beloved pieces of architecture anywhere in the world. The Italians would never leave it so long without maintenance work that huge chunks of it were disappearing below the surface. That wouldn't make any sense. So what's really going on in these pictures? If Russia and Italy isn't proof enough for you, then consider the fact that we also seem to have had builders tasked with digging out buildings in Paris, France, too. The picture you're seeing here is from 1974, taken when Forum Les Halles was being built on the site of the older Les Halles building. Look how far below the surface of the road the building goes. Of course, a large building needs strong foundations, but this is extreme. The depth is more than 50 feet. If you want a sense of scale, the building you can see in scaffolding to the right-hand side is the Fontaine des Innocents. This particular pit was open for several years. The old Les Halles was demolished in 1971, giving everyone a good view of this apparently forgotten world beneath the surface. Apparently, nobody thought to ask why we now live so much higher in the air than the original street level. This isn't just a small difference of a few feet. With the exception of the Eiffel Tower, you could fit all of the current top layer of Paris into the chasm of older buildings which apparently exists below it. Look at this underground cavern in Prague. Now it's a tourist hotspot, and a great place to come and take a few pictures. Does it really look like it was originally built to be underground to you, though? Consider the archways and the structure of the ceilings. Underground tunnels don't need such elaborate designs. It's likely that this entire floor of the building was once at street level, but over time a whole extra layer of prog has been placed on top of it, turning it into a dungeon. We said the problem was worldwide, not just European, and we meant it. Consider any image or video taken of a picturesque holiday location in Egypt now, and then compare it to footage taken 100 years ago or more. Look at the level of the sand around the pyramids and the Sphinx. It's moved significantly. Yes, sandstorms in the desert are an issue, but not to the point where famous buildings should be drowning in it. Hopefully by now you can see the pattern. No matter where we look, we find old buildings where the original structure appears to disappear well below the level of the land. Again, we are not talking about the foundations here. Every building has them. We are talking about instances such as this, where there are clearly areas of building below ground that used to be doors and windows. Windows would not have been opened out into the underground, and these old bricked-up doorways were surely once at ground level. How can the ground level of any city have changed to such a degree that the ground level is now 10 or 20 feet higher than it used to be? Well, let's look at some possible explanations. First, there is the question of something historians call the cultural layer. This is a layer of dirt, grime, dust, and mud built up by human habitation over a period of many years. The busier an area is, the more the cultural layer will build up. The majority of historians feel that this is the most likely explanation for street levels seemingly rising so much over comparatively short periods of time, and would also explain why the problem seems to be at its worst in major cities. After all, that's where most of the people are, so that's where the cultural layer would build up the most. The issue with this is that people clean streets. We may now be more attentive with keeping our streets and roads tidy than we were in the past, but it seems unlikely that anyone would allow so much filth to build up outside their front door that they could no longer open it. Think about it. If your building was being buried, would you go outside and clean away all the dirt? Or would you just accept it and move your front door to the next floor up? We can accept the idea that perhaps a cultural layer of 1 or 2 feet may build up over a century or two, but any more than that seems very unlikely. Another popular theory is that enormous dust storms could have blown through our cities and buried everything they found under waves of dust and mud that came along with the storm. This may have more credence to it. We can see in footage from the United States of America that a dust storm can do more damage than people probably imagine. Look at these classic cars almost completely buried under debris after just one dust storm. With a few such storms over a short period of time, we can imagine that the lower floor of a building might be completely buried. A few centuries ago, cities didn't have as many trees in them as they do now. They were also often surrounded by large, undeveloped areas of flat grassland, where a dust storm could gather pace and mass. Without anything to interrupt the flow of a dust storm, they could be truly devastating. It's even possible that this is the natural way cities have built up over time. We have heard from Canadian historians who say that their major cities are built on top of old cities, which are now 10 feet below the ground. The same is true of Edinburgh in Scotland, where tourists are charged for admission to go and walk around the old underground city. It was thought to be easier to build on the side of an existing building, because the old building already had foundations which could support the further weight. As the new building was built, the old one would subside into the ground. Sometimes city planners just got it wrong. The original location of buildings and roads was too low to avoid the risk of flooding, and so it was necessary to build higher in order to improve safety. The roads were relayered, the buildings grew, and the old structures below them were forgotten about. Conquest and war have a tale to tell here too. In times of antiquity, a conquering army would often build their temples and monuments on the shattered remains of what came before them. Consider the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem. which contains parts of the old Temple of Solomon, and is even built on top of its old walls and foundations. During Bolshevik times in Russia, when religious buildings were torn down, the foundations and lower floors of those buildings were often used to support the new structures which were erected in their place. Paris, Moscow, and the other cities we've looked at were not experiencing times of war. But who's to say they didn't remember these wartime methods when carrying out building work? Perhaps they no longer liked the condition or architectural style of the buildings that existed before, and decided it was easier to build on top of them than knock them down. There are, of course, more fanciful ideas. Some people like to believe that an asteroid or meteorite struck the Earth and caused an enormous dust cloud that swamped half of the Earth some 300 years ago. The people of the time may not have understood what had happened and simply assumed there had been an enormous dust storm. They rebuilt their cities on top of what had been lost and carried on with their lives. Another possibility, a supervolcano, like the one under Yellowstone Park in America, erupted and sent catastrophic amounts of volcanic ash into the atmosphere. That, too, could have fallen like a dust cloud and buried much of what was beneath it. There would likely have been an enormous loss to human life in such a scenario, though, and so it seems odd that there's no mention of any such event in our history books. Is the speculation off base? Or is there something historians don't want to tell us? We don't have all the answers, and it seems nobody else does either. The cultural layer explanation that historians like to use doesn't seem to fit the bill, but there are also holes in the other theories we've put forward. Has there really been an enormous worldwide disaster in the past few centuries that nobody wants to tell us about? Or would that be one conspiracy theory too far? Perhaps the truth is somewhere in between all of the theories. Or perhaps you have a better idea. Have you seen buried cities in your hometown or city and heard tales of how they came to be? We'd love to hear those tales. Even if you don't have any first-hand experience of buried cities and buildings, we want to know your thoughts. Why are there buried buildings in so many big cities around the world? Leave us your belief down in the comments. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, and you will be the first to know when a new video comes out. Thank you for watching, and see you soon.